Much everyone for coming to the Wisconsin Cleantech Network monthly, well actually quarterly forum. My name is Joe Kramer. I'm CEO of Isomark, which is a medical device company here in town. You might be wondering what am I doing with Cleantech. But about 6 years ago when I worked with the Wisconsin Technology Council as the director for the Wisconsin Angel Network, I noticed there's really sort of a dearth of startups in the clean tech space. So we thought if we brought together the community regularly to meet up and network, that hopefully stimulate a little bit more of entrepreneurial activity. So just want to thank our co-sponsors and organizers, the Wisconsin Technology Council, Godfrey & Kahn, and we have Art Harrington here from there, MWork, and the Wisconsin Energy Institute. So we have a great panel discussion today. And actually, I'm going to hand it over to Art to kick things off. Art.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And I want to welcome all of you. This is really a great, knowledgeable audience here looking out here. Knowledgeable about the policy we're going to be talking about today, which is the mg&e rate case. My name is Art Harrington. I'm with Godfrey & Kahn, and I have the privilege to head our environmental renewable energy efficiency team. And when I talk about our panel today, it's trite sometimes to say this is a group of people that need no introduction, but I think it's truly applicable to our panel today. I think we've assembled a really knowledgeable panel to talk about our topic today. And on my right, your left, is Scott Neitzel, Executive Vice President at mg&e. Obviously out of the front on the mg&e rate case. We're really glad to have Scott here. And Tyler Hebner, who everybody knows from Renew Energy, from Renew Wisconsin, very much involved in these policy issues, rate cases that are coming across the state now and impacts on renewable energy. Tyler, we're really glad to have you here.
Thanks.
Then on my left, on your right, is Todd Stewart. Todd is the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Energy Industrial Group, is obviously front and center on all the rate cases and the impacts on large energy users in the state. Todd, it's really glad to have you as a part of the panel. And then Chuck McGinnis, who's a director with Energy Solutions at Johnson Controls, and focuses a lot on energy efficiency. So I think that's another important topic that I think is impacted by these rate cases. And Chuck, we're really glad to have you with us. So a little bit about what we want to do today. I want to give some opening remarks and set the stage, I think, for our discussion on the rate case. And talk a little bit about the Clean Power Plan as a way to introduce the importance of this issue. And then I'm going to have each of the panel members give a short presentation. I think Scott is probably going to have the most time for these presentations to give a little overview of the rate case. And then it'll be followed by Tyler on his thoughts, introductory comments, then by Todd on the impact of these issues from his clients' perspectives, and then Chuck is going to talk a little bit about his perspective on energy efficiency. And then I'm going to actually, my theme as a moderator on this is to try to trigger a discussion with our panel members, and I think some very important policy issues, energy policy, that underlies this rate case and other rate cases. So we'll have hopefully a little bit of interchange here with our panel members. And then, of course, I want to open it up to the audience for some questions. But I would ask you to hold your questions until we go through our presentations. I have the opportunity to do a little interplay with our guests. And then I would open it up for your questions on this important topic. Does that make sense? Okay, so just by way of introduction, if any of you in this audience have not read a summary of the Clean Power Plan, you're missing a very important policy development that is relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, because it has a tremendous potential impact on coal-fired generation across the country, and in particular in this state, because we have such a high base load of above 60% of baseload coal-fired generation. And this is a Obama administration EPA's proposal to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired generation, and is established as a proposal with deadlines due December 1, to how the states need to be thinking about reaching a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the regulated facilities by 2030 from a baseline in 2012. A big goal. And EPA has outlined 4 different policies that the states consider. It's not going to be an exclusive list, but those 4 policies are going to be impacted on what we're going to be talking about today. The first policy has to do with trying to make coal-fired facilities more efficient in terms of how they're operating with emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. The second building block has to do with potential switching to existing natural gas plants on baseload as a way to meet that goal. The third goal has an opportunity to have more clean, renewable energy as another building block. And the fourth recommended goal is how we can energize, pardon the pun, energy efficiency program, demand side issues to try to get carbon reductions as a result of those energy efficiency programs. Now, this is a proposal, but think a little bit when we have this discussion today, the overlay of that proposal and how this plays out in policy on energy generation in Wisconsin. I think it's a very relevant issue. EPA is going to finalize this rule. The target is June of next year. And then the states are going to have 1 year to provide their state implementation plan as to how these emission goals are going to be reached. Very important time in our state and in our country in terms of the opportunity to impact these discussions and policies and comments. So I want to bring this to your attention and just think about that policy and the impact on some of the things we're going to be talking about. So having given that brief introduction, I want to turn it over to you, Scott, maybe to talk a little bit about mg&e's proposal. It's obviously been a lot of media coverage, and we really welcome your comments to give us a little bit overview of mg&e's proposal and the goals that you want to accomplish with that.
Sure, thanks, Art. Appreciate it. And just like to thank you also for the promotion that I just got. My title is actually Senior Vice President, not Executive Vice President.
If you do a good job, we'll make sure.
So I appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk about our rate proposals. I look around the room, I think there's a lot of people here who are pretty familiar with what we're doing, but just let me give an overview for those who may not be familiar and kind of what the genesis of our proposal was. I think a number of people here were at the Repower Madison get-together at the public library where Mike Noble from, is it Refresh Energy? Refresh. And Mike described this issue going forward that we are also struggling with, this public policy issue of when you have a grid that was designed for kind of just a one-way interaction, just the push out from the central generating station, going into a future where it's going to be more two-way, more interactive. And when you have the ability of customers to interplay with the utility in different ways than we've had in the past, how do you, in that new world, make sure that the system, the distribution system, the grid, is reliably maintained going forward? You know, the utility has the obligation of universal service. We have to make sure that every customer is served, and that's what makes the utility a little bit different. So we have this obligation to make sure that we're making the grid available to everybody in the fairest possible manner, that the costs of providing those services actually line up with the rates to the extent we can make that happen. So the rates that we have today and have had for a long time, basically, kind of came out of that central generation model where we're pushing it out, where there was no distributed generation. Customers didn't have a lot of options. So here again, how do you deal with the world where customers have options and make sure that the system is fairly, the costs of the system are fairly allocated, here again, for the services that are used? There's a number of, and I'm sure we'll get into these, there's a number of policy options that you can take when you look at this issue. And going back to Mike Noble, he, I think, talked about the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I don't remember the person's name, but Mike described this as a wicked problem. And so I think we're all here, and everybody who's interested in this industry going forward, trying to figure out how to solve that wicked problem of when you go to a more interactive grid with people taking power, putting power on, is essentially using the grid as a battery function. how do we address that as a society overall? And it's just not an issue for mg&e or the Wisconsin utilities. This is an issue for all utilities, at least in the United States and probably North America, and to some extent around the world, as we've seen, this change kind of take place. So that's the backdrop of what we're trying to accomplish. Now, what are we actually asking for in the rate case? Because I think sometimes that may get lost in a lot of the kind of back and forth. It's actually fairly simple. What we're asking for is that the customer charge is set at the actual cost of providing those customer services that do not change with energy use. So that customer charge, and I'll just stick to the residential customers, that customer charge goes from a current $10.44 to a customer charge of $15, okay? That is at our cost of service as we put it together in our studies. Now, if you go in the rate case, everybody has a study on how you allocate cost, but that's where our number was at. The other thing that we've done is across the board implement a $4 grid connection fee, which covers kind of the basic infrastructure that's needed to provide the minimal service to a customer. So where that leaves you at the end of the day then is with a $19 kind of fixed charge for our residential customers. That's it. Okay. What we didn't do, which I think is sometimes lost in debate, what we didn't do is we made no changes to any of our renewable net metering programs. None. Zero. Others have done that. What we wanted here again was just to go back to the basic principles. We have these customer costs that don't change with customer usage. Our customer service center, our building, the billing system, and then the grid connection fee for the minimal distribution service needed to serve all customers that are connected to the grid. And at this point, most customers are connected to the grid. You hear a lot of discussion about off the grid. We're going off the grid. That usually doesn't mean that somebody's cut their wire and is taking no services from the utility. Off the grid, I think, most of the time refers to I am producing on-site as much energy as I'm using over some period of time, but very rarely is that instantaneous. So going back to my previous point, because that's not instantaneous, the utility, the grid, has to be there. So what is the fair way to pay for that grid, going back to where I started, in that context? And so that's what our rate case was about. It wasn't about, we're going after this or going after that. It was, what are the costs to serve a customer? And we want to make sure that those are recovered in a fair way so that the grid is sustainable long-term for everybody, so that it can accommodate that two-way flow, so that it can be there for everybody, so that there is universality of service. So that was kind of the backdrop of our proposal that we have in front of the commission right now. Okay. I can leave it there.
Just a follow-up question.
Sure.
Did you give the audience an idea of the timeline for the rate case and when you expect to have the agency decide it?
Yeah, I think we would expect a decision before the end of the year, and actually probably a decision before December, just how these things are lining up. And then usually, just as in the normal rate case process, we usually get an order from the commission by the end of the year or early part of next year.
Okay. Well, thank you, Scott. I guess, Tyler, I want to turn to you because obviously you have a very important constituency that you're watching this rate case and others closely. I think we'd all be interested in your comments on this topic.
Yeah. So I'm Tyler Hebner, Executive Director of Renew Wisconsin. We're a small nonprofit that spends most of our time looking out from a policy perspective, how can we grow the renewable energy industry here in Wisconsin, and that's solar, wind energy, as well as bioenergy, a little bit of hydropower as well. we have been engaged in rate cases for a long, long time. We've been around for 23 years and been engaged in commission proceedings for that time. There's never been a series of rate cases with more interest from the public than the ones that are currently before us. And I think a lot of that has to do with, we feel like we are at this crossing point where some more action needs to happen on energy savings, on renewables, on a clean power plan, and these proposals from the utilities, in our opinion, will make this more difficult to meet these future goals we have of business creation, entrepreneurship, reducing carbon emissions, et cetera. So where I'll start with is with the Supreme Court of the United States. Federal Power Commission versus Hope Natural Gas. This is a 1944 case that said it is not the theory, but the impact of the rate order which counts. So from our perspective, the utilities, mg&e, We Energies, and Wisconsin Public Service have put forth a different theoretical framework for how they would like to collect their costs. And the response that you've seen mostly is related to the impacts and the people that are going to be impacted by this. And so groups that you've heard from range from AARP, which represents adults 50 and over in Wisconsin. They are concerned about the impact of a $19 bill from your electric company before you even have to turn on a light in a month. So today it's $10.44. In the future, if this is approved, it'll be $19. Nothing you can do to get out of that $19. And what that means is that for a person that their bill is maybe $100 a month, they were paying $10 fixed and now it's $19, and they'll see a small break on the energy charge. And so for those people, it will be around the same. But if you only pay, let's say, $40 a month, your bill is going up almost that whole $9. And who pays $40 a month? Well, it's people in apartments, small users, people in apartments. A lot of fixed income people have bills that are that low. It's people without air conditioners, right? So thinking people that don't use a lot of electricity in many cases are people that don't have a lot of expendable income to spend, and they're trying to save. And this proposal is going to do two things. One, it's going to raise their bills, and two, it's going to take control away from them from being able to save on their bills. Okay, so that is the major source of concern from many of the constituents involved. There's also a lot of concern related to energy conservation and energy efficiency. So here in Wisconsin, we have what's called an energy priorities law that says to the extent possible, technically possible, and economically feasible, we should be meeting our energy needs with energy efficiency and conservation first, and then with clean, non-polluting renewables second. By reducing the rebalancing that's happening is more of your charges in fixed component, and you get a break on the per kilowatt hour electric rate. That's going to make energy efficiency less cost effective, which means that if a person is going out looking at, am I going to spend that $5,000 to insulate my house? Well, before it was going to take me 12 years to pay that back. Now it's going to take me 14. For some people, that's fine, but there's a marginal effect where you're going to have less people interested in conserving energy. Let's see. I took some other notes. Yeah.
Art, wait, time. I did not
This
want
panel's
to.
already starting to get out of control.
I did not. I mean, we've heard a lot of the criticisms, and I'll be happy to come back and address those.
No, and I would like
I
to
didn't
give
want to.
everybody the
I didn't want to
opportunity.
just go through that whole thing right
I
from the
appreciate
get-go.
that, Scott, and we'll get back to you, I think, with a reply to that.
Yeah. And I think the other main argument that our organization and many others are putting forward in the rate case specifically is that what mg&e and other utilities have done is said, this is all of our residential customers, and we're going to add up all of what we consider the costs to be to serve those customers and divide it by 140,000 residential customers, and that is your fair share. Every customer pays the same for all those expenses. And in reality, what the witnesses are trying to put forth is that that's not the case. That it is the case, in fact, the opposite, that people that use less amount of electricity also cause fewer costs. So people that live in a 50-unit apartment building cause fewer costs than the person that lives in a 4,000 square foot mansion. And therefore, it is not true to say that adding up all these residential customers and dividing by the total gets you to the pro rata correct share. So that is another piece of the argument, just around the calculation of what are all these costs, and can you show us that low users actually cause the same costs as high users? And what we're putting forth is we want to see that study because it hasn't been presented. There's also been a tremendous amount of talk about distributed generation or customers that have solar on their roof. That's the primary technology. There's some that have small wind turbines. And whether or not, if you have solar on your roof, you're paying your fair share of the costs. And I think that is an interesting question, but I think that we need to have a discussion about, well, what are the costs and what are the benefits? Because going forward in a world where carbon has a price, if customers are putting solar on their roof and investing their own money in a technology that doesn't have carbon emissions and is therefore reducing the number of carbon emissions in the community, but MG&E didn't have to pay anything for those reduced emissions, there's value there that's created by that customer. So what is that value worth? There's also the idea that going forward, if we look over the long term, if you have a whole bunch of people putting solar on their roof, could it not be the case that in the future we don't need to build peaking power plants because we have enough solar on the grid to account for those swings in the middle of the summer on hot days? And there's a bunch of technical arrangements and technical things related to that and how you do that correctly. But there have been these studies that have been done, and they call them value of solar, or somehow trying to evaluate the costs and the benefits of solar. And when those studies are done, as they've been done by We Energies here in Milwaukee, comes out that the value of solar over 30 years is about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. That study was done in 2009 when the retail electric rate was around 11 or 12 cents. So it turns out that looking forward, the value is actually more than, or could be around the same over that 30-year time frame as the cost. So you've got to add up all the benefits. You can't just talk about the costs. It's a key distinction. The other big point that we're making is nothing has changed in Madison Gas and Electric territory or the other territories that warrants such a dramatic shift today, right now. As of today, right now, there's about 170 net metered customers, about 320 total that have solar installations on their property out of 140,000. So we're talking about not 1%, okay, not even 0.1%, 0.07% of the customers, 0.07%. So it's just a very, very small number of people that are participating in these kind of programs, such that the impact, if there is some sort of cross-subsidy happening, would be less than a penny per month for every customer's bill. Okay, a penny per month impact, and the fixed charge increase is just short of $7, $6.50, or wait, just short of $9, $8.50. So that is, those are the key arguments in the case. And I think I'll stop there. Okay. And let Scott rebut me, or let's, I'll give it to you to go down.
Go down the line first,
but
Tyler.
Definitely want to talk about the broader policies too. But
I appreciate that, Tyler. And just to summarize, I mean, it sounds like the concern is really how to fairly deal with some of these stranded cost issues as we get this emerging technology, and how do you deal on the fairness side with some of the lower users on the scale that correlates with income. And I want to use that as a segue to turn over to Todd, because Todd represents huge users, many of which a large percentage of their bottom line is going to electricity, and a little bit a much different constituency than Tyler's representing here. And I guess I'd be interested, and I'm sure the audience would, Todd, on your perspective on some of these rate case issues that are bubbling up.
Sure. Well, thank you, Art. Thanks for having me. Just to put a little bit more perspective on that. My association is called the Wisconsin Industrial Energy Group. There are about 30 of the largest energy consumers in the state. Wisconsin's a very manufacturing-heavy state, and therefore is an energy-intensive state. When you look across the country, we have one of the largest percentage of industrial customers of just about anywhere industrial usage. It's often a third or more of the electricity sold to many of the utilities in the state, whereas it might be like 25% on the national average. It's typically member companies, it's in one of their top 3 costs. Usually labor, raw material, and energy, it's in one of their top 3. So it's often $1 million a month, $2 million, $3 million a month usage that they have. So they care about it quite a bit. And that said, mg&e is a little bit unusual because they don't have that many industrial customers.
What percentage of your membership are actually in their rate territory?
Not very many.
Okay.
Only a handful. Whereas pub service, for example, in the Green Bay, Fox Valley areas where we have a very high concentration. We Energies in the southeast is again a manufacturing heavy state. So mg&e is much more dependent on, say, government, university, things like that, much higher on commercial and residential than other utilities in the state. So that said, for my reporter friends in the audience and things like that, I don't have that much of a dog in the fight, to be honest, in this particular rate case, because quite frankly, it does not really impact industrial customers all that much. There may be a tiny amount of dollars move around. So we have been relatively quiet on this issue, and relatively quiet is a relative term in this case with all the Sturm and Drang. I did not bring an inflatable coal plant with me today. I do have large customers that can inflate that for you,
So you're
perhaps at a
carbon
discount.
dioxide, right?
In fact, they are. I can tell you, air separation type companies are some of the largest energy customers in the state because it takes a heck of a lot of electricity to. They're essentially bottling chemicals and using a heck of a lot of electricity when they do it. Sometimes that can be over half their cost or more. So that said, I don't have that much of a dog in the fight, and so you can stop taking notes now. But I will say this, on principle, I think this is a no-brainer. Meaning mg&e it's very defensible. Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. There are a ton of fixed costs that are not being recovered as fixed, period. I mean, so I can stop right there, but I mean, it's not even close. On the residential side, it is grossly under-recovered for the fixed charges. Now, you can argue about that. We can, my witnesses and your witnesses can, this is what we do all day. That's how I make a living is hiring lawyers and consultants, and you battle it out at the PSC. But really, if you look at every utility in the state, and it's not uncommon across the country to have this. I mean, when you look across the country, the residential fixed charge is grossly under-recovered, not just here, but around the country. And you did see a lot of testimony in these cases. Munis and co-ops obviously collect a lot more on the residential side for a fixed charge. The water utilities, I see some water folks here. Your water, and in fact, I think, what was the headline today? A 30% rate hike for the Madison water utility is being proposed. If you look at your water bill, there's way more collected on the fixed side. Now, why is that? Well, there are public policy reasons. But if it comes to just a purely accounting, regulatory rate making, I do think that MG is right when you come to an accounting, just from an accounting or rate setting principle. Now that said, rate setting is always said to be an art, not a science, right? And I hate that actually when that comes out. When commissioners say that, I hate when they say it's an art, not a science. There is a bit of a fudge factor, right? There just is. So under the regulatory compact, you're supposed to generally follow cost causation, cost of service. You're supposed to generally follow that. Now there are times when that gets overridden for various things, rate impact, social good, what have you. But it's generally supposed to follow cost causation. And fixed costs should be in the fixed bucket, and variable costs should be in the variable bucket. That's just the way it should be, but I know there's the real world and the economic world, and then there's the world we live in. So, you know, I'm trying to think of a few other things to add. You know, for example, in this case, and in many of the cases that are pending right now, the average customer, average residential customer electric bill pays about $100 per month, roughly, for their electric. Right now, about $88 of that is variable, and about 12 of that is fixed, roughly speaking. You know, there is, depending on who you believe, that number can go up to what, $50, $60, $70, depending on the utility, depending on what you want to count as fixed or not. Clearly, there is plenty of room to go up. So under that lens, if it goes to, say, $16 a month, or $19, or even $25, it's a pretty modest amount of movement. Depends on your definition of modest. It's when you start, how long you give, you know, how big of a jump do you take in one time. But clearly there is a lot of room to go up if you go by the book. And so flip that around a little bit. If an industrial customer, because a lot of my members, say a paper mill that are quite steady, if we said we wanted to collect everything on the fixed side and almost nothing on variable, we would get laughed out of the commission. I mean, that is just not credible. You could not go in with a straight face and say, I want to pay almost 100% on fixed and none on variable. That would not fly, and you'd look absurd. So I can't make that argument. Industrials do, in every rate case, we do fight about how much should be fixed and how much should be variable. That's something that happens in every rate case. We argue that every time, but it's in the ballpark. It's not orders of magnitude off. And so I could not come in and credibly try and say that we should do that. Usually the commission approves things in gradual steps. And so it is under what you believe is gradual and what you believe is modest, but clearly there is room to move up. So I probably could add more, but you know, I think there are other topics you want to do too. So we'll see how it goes back and forth.
Just to follow up, so WIG has not filed any comments on the mg&e case?
Yeah, we have, and there's one customer that really takes the lead on it because they have, you know, they typically carry the load. In mg&e's case, we've done very little. Where we do a lot more is on, say, this year pub service and We Energies, but all the utilities have rate cases in right now. Rate cases in this year, and we're heavily involved in all those. But we do have one customer that's quite active. Okay. And all the briefs were in today. It's a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Well, it keeps you busy, Todd. I know it does. And the industrial group is lucky to have you in a leadership role on these very important issues. And I guess I'll turn to our final panel member, Chuck McGinnis, because obviously you heard from Tyler and also from Scott that we're talking about now, and also from Todd, the switch now to a fixed charge and how this could affect energy efficiency. We're talking to Chuck McGinnis here, who's with a company that's really focusing in on energy efficiency as a business model in terms of your customers. So I'm sure we'll all be interested, Chuck, on your thoughts on this proposal.
Well, thanks, Art. So, you know, I'll talk a little bit about Johnson Controls and our background, provide some comments relative to energy efficiency and how we believe it's a very important part of energy policy, share with you some research that we've done on the recent rate case, and then just part with a couple comments. So Johnson Controls, for many of you who may know this, was founded in 1885 in Whitewater, Wisconsin. Professor Warren Johnson didn't like the temperature of his classroom, so he invented an electric thermostat and a damper flapper. And fast forward to today, we have 140,000 employees. We did $42 billion in sales in the last year, and we're proud to be a Wisconsin company. And our employees are really focused on building a comfortable, safe, and sustainable world so that we can live in a great place. We have 3 different business units focused on power solutions, automotive interiors, and building efficiency. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our building efficiency business and share with you what some of our findings have been relative to the marketplace, our customers. So we believe that energy efficiency really should be our first priority as it relates to solving some of our energy policy issues. Some people call it the fifth fuel, which is potentially a new source of economic growth because it's our fastest, cheapest, and cleanest alternative for energy policy. We save a lot of money for consumers and for businesses. And we promote a model that's called energy savings performance contracting, whereby the energy services company, Johnson Controls being one of those companies, actually guarantees that the energy savings offsets the cost of installing measures for energy efficiency. It's a great model, one that's been widely adopted in Dane County over the years. Just about every major commercial customer, and I'll be talking primarily about commercial types of customers. We talked about residential, we talked about industrial. Commercial buildings are like the buildings we're in here. Could be small retail, could be a school, as an example, for a commercial building. And so as it relates to commercial buildings, many of these buildings in Dane County have done performance contracting over the years. The state of Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison, most of the hospitals, the school districts, you name it. And primarily because actually mg&e introduced the model in 1988 through an innovative ESCO program where they selected energy services companies to develop these large-scale energy efficiency projects. So in thinking about today's discussion, we wanted to really review what would be the impact of the new rate case to commercial buildings, because there's a lot of them out there. So we actually looked at about 5 different buildings, but specifically 3, and we modeled what would be the impact of the new rate case on their utility bill in the current rate structure versus the new, and then how would we look at an energy efficiency project in that building relative to the existing rate case compared to the new. And we looked at 3 different rates. Looked at CG5, CG4B, and CG2. And it was interesting to find with CG5, we found that their utility bill for that building, given the same weather pattern, would actually come down about 4%. The energy efficiency project, although the mix of measures was slightly different, wouldn't impact their demand for energy efficiency with the new rate case. So we kind of liked what it did for CG5. CG4B, we found that there was no impact, again, on their utility budget, and that, again, the measures would shift a little bit more so than CG5 in the energy efficiency mix with load management. But again, we thought that energy efficiency would not be impacted in CG4B.
Going from larger to smaller customers. Not everybody knows what CG5 or CG4 means.
Yeah, and maybe you could, yeah.
If you're going, and you want me to go, I'll go from smaller, CG5, CG4, CG2, and CG6. It's an anomaly of history that the numbers don't go, but it's so if you're going up, it's 5,
The lower
4.
the number, the bigger the customer.
Not quite, because CG6 is bigger than CG2. That's why I said it's kind of an anomaly.
That's a good clarification.
And we're,
The difference between CG4A, A being 20 to 75 kilowatt peak demand, and B being 75 to 200.
Correct.
and bear in mind, we just picked these buildings because we know these buildings. We didn't even know what rate structure we were going to be looking at when we picked them, but these were buildings that we do work in. In one case, it was our branch building, and we had their utility information. So then we looked at CG2, and CG2, again, they were, with the same weather pattern, there would be essentially no impact on their utility bill, and their energy savings would actually go, we had developed an 8-year payback project. It went to 7.7 years, so it actually improved. And we were frankly surprised by this and pleased that we learned this. So we thought that this particular rate case was a relatively good solution. after doing our research. And so as it relates to what we think we should be doing in the future, we think that energy efficiency and performance contracting should be first and foremost a great solution for energy policy. And we think that there's a unique opportunity with 111D coming down the path to leverage energy efficiency.
Which is a reference to the Clean Power Plan.
The Clean Power Plan, yeah. Okay. We think there's a great opportunity to leverage energy efficiency as one of the 4 alternatives and use energy savings performance contracting as a model because you can aggregate it. It's already measured. All you have to do is add the emissions component, the incentive, and then the enforcement, and it's a great solution set for that larger policy issue.
Well, thanks, Chuck. And I want to, Scott, give you the last word here in our opening remarks because there were some tough criticisms here from Tyler on some of the issues, in particular, you know, dealing with the low-income customers' impacts and also the value proposition of some clean technology like solar, how that is dealt with in this rate case. So I want to give you maybe 3 or 4 minutes just to kind of give a rejoinder on your point.
Sure. And, you know, here again, as we've went through the panel, what you begin to understand is that there's a lot of competing, you know, kind of interests and outlooks here. And one of the things that we've always tried to do, whether it's this rate case or in the past, is kind of find a balance. I mean, we have to balance. That's what we have to as public policy. That's our responsibility as a utility here again that serves all customers. We have to look at the balance and what's fair to all customers. And I also want to say there's nothing in our proposal that we are still extremely committed to energy conservation programs, and that's not going to change. I think Chuck referenced that we were a leader. We still plan on being a leader. This rate case is about kind of the allocation of costs for services. Low-income use customers, I did not address this in my opening remarks, but if there is a low-income customer who wants to stay on our current rates, we do have that as a provision that a low-income customer could stay on the current rates. So we've addressed that issue, kind of grandfather them in. That's an optional rate that they could have because some may be better off on that rate. Others may be better off on our newer rate. We think that customers, you know, Tyler mentioned that we lower the variable charge slightly, about a penny, but there's still a lot of incentive to conserve in that 13 or 14 cents for a residential customer. And when we talk about the fixed variable, just kind of cleaning up some of these things, Todd mentioned that currently about 88% of our costs are recovered through a variable rate. Under our proposal, that goes to 79%. So really the ratio doesn't change by a large amount when it comes to that issue. Tyler also mentioned, I think it raises an interesting issue, and maybe one we should talk about, which wasn't on your list, but solar. Do we want to, is it best to orient solar to the south to gain kilowatt hours? Or do we want to orient it more towards the west to gain peak kilowatts, on-peak kilowatts, because solar doesn't necessarily peak at the same time from an output perspective as our utility system. So that's an interesting question, as is the value of solar tariff, which has been tried in many places. And that kind of rolls into my last comment. There are, like I said before, there are a number of options. Tyler mentioned 1 or 2, and I think that's why, you know, our proposal has evolved as we've listened to customers, and we want to continue to do that, and we've announced that we're going to engage our community over the next year. We're not going to make any more structural changes just because of this debate that should occur within our community so that we adequately represent the values of our community going forward while we're trying to still solve this quote-unquote wicked problem that exists out there and make sure that everything's done in a fair manner and the system sustains into this new world of kind of two-way flows with a lot of distributed generation on the utility system.
This is a one-year rate case, is that
correct?
So it's this one-year horizon that we're talking about in this
correct.
proposal?
Correct.
What I want to do is I want to keep on time here because I know you all have some questions, but before we get to your questions, I want to ask a couple follow-up questions to our panel members. Now, Tyler, I heard your comments, and I think one of the concerns you have is this, for the first time, this fixed costs, how it's going to deal with people who are looking for innovative solutions, maybe on solar for their own house. And as we get emerging technology where we're, potentially battery storage that will allow people for the first time to be thinking about, getting off of the system.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts about how you should be dealing with the stranded costs that the mg&es, We Energies have invested in this system, a base load system? What are your thoughts about when technology is being generated that will allow for the first time people to start thinking about getting off the grid? How do you deal with the stranded cost issue for that group?
Yeah, great question. I'll take it in two parts. The first of which is the sort of technology evolution here around, which you're seeing in a lot of other states that have financing models that are really pushing and allowing people, for example, to get solar for no money down and pay for it over the life of the solar panel system. Huge difference than here where that's not clearly allowed and therefore you have to pay up front. So in these other states, the evolution of technology is really happening at a much faster pace. And there are companies like Solar City that's a leader in solar installations that is now investing in their own battery technology. And the two guys that run Solar City, their cousin is the guy that runs Tesla electric vehicles. And so they're all in this together trying to build better batteries both for their electric vehicles on the Tesla side as well as to put in people's homes. So I was surprised a month ago when I read an interview with the CEO of Solar City who said, we don't want people to get solar and batteries and unplug from the grid. We want people to get solar and batteries and stay part of the grid because we can provide more value if we've got batteries distributed around the system that in those moments where you need a spike, instead of having to turn on a peaker power plant, you've used batteries. So to suffice it to say, the technology is evolving very quickly, and whether people will use batteries to get off grid or not, I think is a very open question at this point. But I think the stranded cost issue is a critically important one. There's kind of an ongoing question in Ohio about exactly this, which is a coal plant that is not selling enough electricity or not getting enough value, but the reliability people are saying that it needs to run, and so what do you do? I think it's just a critically important question, and that's why Renew Wisconsin and a number of other organizations in these rate cases are saying, let's take a time out here. There are a lot of things changing. You've got technology changing. Utility business model ideas are coming down the pike. You've got Clean Power Plan that we need to really think strongly about how are we going to meet that the most cost-effective way. You've got these potential stranded assets. You've got solar and people that are making the choice because they want to put solar on their roof. And are you going to allow that? Are you going to encourage that kind of choice? Or are you going to stifle that kind of choice? And then out not too far in the future, you've got, the best car ever created, ever scored by Consumer Reports is now an electric vehicle. Tesla got a 99. It's like the best car ever built. So you've got this Tesla, you've got people driving Chevy Volts, you've got people driving Nissan Leafs. If you ask these people, they love their cars. They really love their cars. And so this electric vehicle market that's going to take a whole bunch of money and emissions from the transportation sector over the next few decades and move it into the electric sector might increase mg&e's sales to the point where they don't care about a few people putting solar on anymore. I mean, there's just a number of things that are going on at the same time, and that's why we need to have a much broader discussion about the pluses and the minuses of all these. So the stranded assets I won't address directly except for to say it's one problem, it's one piece of a much larger set of potential options that we all need to discuss, and we think like a more generic docket, a more open discussion led by the PSC would lead Wisconsin to a better result than just looking at these individual rate cases.
Any other quick follow-up thoughts on the stranded cost issue that I posed to Tyler?
Well, I just want to follow up. We're very supportive of people putting solar on the roof. This is a question about the grid and how it gets paid for over time in a sustainable way that's fair to everybody. So, I would just...
I wouldn't say mg&e is necessarily favorable or not, but I think it's a broader public policy
Let's just have
question.
Scott finish his thought here.
So, here again, that's why we didn't have a special tariff for DG. We didn't go, it was just what's the cost, the customer cost, and should we recover those costs? That's what our rate case is about. So I just wanted to make sure that, we're agnostic to technology.
Okay. One question for you, Scott. I mean, one of the challenges that utilities have is some of the current planning requirements in terms of how you have to plan for some interruptions to the system. And generally, the Public Service Commission and its policy takes a pretty conservative approach in terms of what kind of capacity you have to plan for issues. Is there any way that you think there should be a different look at how you plan for total capacity at peak times in terms of if there's going to be interruptions that could help further this debate on some emerging technology? Any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I think that conservative planning benchmark has served the state very well, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think going forward, because we are more dependent.
We're talking about what, the 18% reserve capacity?
Well, it's now 14.5% reserve margin that we have to have. I think it behooves the economy overall and all the participants to make sure that the system is reliable. And I would not want to do anything that kind of shave that too tight, because I think the economic dislocations that would happen because of a system that is less reliable would not be helpful. At the very same time, we need a system that's more reliable, given how customers are using more electronics, data, sensitivity. So, the planning margin is kind of set really by now the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator and kind of blessed by the state. But I think we should, until all this kind of shakes out, we should still use a fairly conservative planning model to make sure that the system is always going to be there when people need it.
Well, I want to turn now to Todd a little bit, kind of a follow-up on this question in terms of the system. We're talking a base load system. There's a lot of emerging technology, and I think Tyler talked about a little bit about distributed generation and how that might reduce some of the risks that we're talking about on the planning side. I was just wondering if WIG and its members have given any thought to the emergence of distributed generation, and how do you encourage, or maybe you don't encourage, that as part of future development in the existing distribution system?
Sure, and just to maybe build on what Scott said a little bit, I'm looking out over this crowd, and this is a different crowd. How many people have heard of MISO before? All right, this is a way different crowd than, normally when I speak at business groups or, chambers of commerce or whatever, maybe one hand will go up, and it's usually on the panel, right? So it's a little bit, you've got the MISO, mg&e and every utility has to meet certain requirements for reliability, just, for federal rules and things like that. So the reserve margin of 14%, may not. There's not much wiggle room on some of that stuff. You have to build your system for the peak time, the peak hour, peak day of the year when people are running their air conditioning. I just want to say this. I know some people may not believe me, but I'll use Scott's phrase. I'm agnostic on technology as far as, large customers want to have a reliable system. But, why pay for a Cadillac when what you need is a Chevy, right? So if there is if what is going to keep your costs down, there's great debate on what keeps your costs down now and over the long term. I think you wanted me to comment on the Clean Power Plan a little bit and where we go from here. And it's highly uncertain. I talk to so many folks that think this is the most uncertain time in the utility industry in their careers. And some of the decisions that are being made now are going to set the course for decades. I don't know how much the Clean Power Plan is going to stick, really. Some of the cheaper ways of meeting it are probably the most legally suspect, and everybody knows there's going to be a lot of litigation for that. I guess a couple different concerns. First of all, Wisconsin is not, from my perspective, is not all that well positioned right now. Because we took so much early action, you're really penalized for the early action that you've taken.
And just what you mean by that is there's a baseline for which improvements you can get credits for. And I think that baseline is beginning June of 2014, isn't that right? Correct.
And just so you know, Wisconsin has almost rebuilt their entire electric grid over the last decade, last 10, 15 years. We've spent something like $4 billion on some of the newest coal plants in the country. We've retrofitted every decent-sized power plant that there is. We're about to finish that job pretty soon. The smaller coal plants that are less efficient or less economic are going to be shut down due to other air emissions rules. We've spent billions on the renewable mandate. We've spent billions on transmission lines. We've spent same amount on energy efficiency over the last few decades. So we've done quite a bit leading up till now, and Wisconsin is hit, I think, something like the 14th hardest of all the states because of the early action and because that we still have plenty of coal. The Midwest has lots of coal. So we've put in a lot of money already, and then going forward, how does that work? And then I guess the other thing is these building blocks don't work together very well. If you have brand new coal plants, how do you get a 6% efficiency? How do you squeeze that out of them? You can do that in other areas of the country, maybe. I'm not even sure that's possible. But so if you got new coal plants or retrofitted ones, how do you do that? If you're going to run your natural gas plants as base load, as running them flat out, they weren't designed to do that. But I'm not sure that's possible. How does that work with renewables? How does that work with the other things? So I think it's very difficult for Wisconsin and plenty of other places to even meet the Clean Power
Is WIG
Plan.
planning on putting any comments in on by the December 1st deadline on the Clean Power Plan?
Well, yeah, I think what will happen is a lot of the black hats, a lot of the large business groups usually all go in together and do joint comments. And we've already done that on the initial comments we did earlier this year. The major, the large energy using groups, so WIG, Paper Council, WMC, foundries, and food processors, and we'll likely do some more for December 1st. So that was maybe more than what you needed. But one reason why we're very concerned is, we're kind of the next in line too, right? So there's the utility on the utility side, but guess what? Once the utility side is done, they're going to come after the larger energy users next, and so there's a concern that we get hit 2 or 3 times because a lot of us are not only are we large energy users, but a lot of us have we're in very competitive markets globally.
Well, I wish we had an hour and a half to deal just with the Clean Power Plan in terms of these issues. They're very important, and I think the ones you're talking about are some of the issues that people are struggling with. And it's I just kind of remind everybody there's a deadline for December 1st for those comments with the EPA Power Plan. And I think the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is putting those comments in on or before that deadline. So I think I'd like to say we live in interesting times. It's very uncertain, and so I just want to alert people of those deadlines. Now, I want to turn to you, Chuck, because energy efficiency is your lifeblood in terms of what you're doing. And, the current model for the mg&es of the world, are to build capital and get a rate of return on capital. Do you have any thoughts about other strategies that might be more beneficial for energy efficiency? For instance, a lot of discussions about decoupling. Any thoughts in terms of the rate model? Given your focus on energy efficiency, should we be looking at some other things, especially with the overlay of the Clean Power Plant coming?
Sure. So I guess I'll speak to kind of 3 points there. One is, I think in general the Wisconsin Focus on Energy program has been pretty successful. Prior to that, I thought the utilities did a fairly good job of delivering energy efficiency in the state. So I think that Wisconsin has a rich history of energy efficiency. We can always improve on that. As it relates to the rates, decoupling is an alternative that removes the...
And everybody understands we use the term decoupling, trying to incentivize the utilities to get actually paid more if there's programs in place to use less energy. That's what we're talking about.
Right. It doesn't penalize them for doing energy efficiency. It separates the revenue and their revenue stream from the shock of selling more or less electricity in a given year. So it takes away the upside. It also takes away the downside. So it removes the risk, but it doesn't incentivize them to necessarily do energy efficiency on its own. Decoupling doesn't. So I think decoupling is potentially an alternative moving forward, as long as there's also an energy efficiency program in place alongside it. As it relates to 111D and the clean energy program that's coming down from the EPA, the regs. I really believe that the scalability of an energy savings performance contracting initiative can really help satisfy the requirements to reduce GHGs in that environment. And frankly, we're worried that energy efficiency is going to get lost in the discussion because there are four different alternatives, many different alternatives underneath each one. And there's still a great opportunity to do more energy efficiency in the marketplace. So we're putting together a roadmap, actually a detailed roadmap to show how energy efficiency could potentially play in those regs.
Okay, that's very helpful. And I want to finish with one last question to Scott before we open it up. Scott, I mean, we've been talking about some emerging technology, and in the current rate system, there really isn't a rate incentive for the utilities to be investing in R&D. I mean, you've got a great trade association in EPRI that does a lot of research on energy technology. Do you have any thoughts at all from a utilities perspective as to whether there should be some incentives given to the utilities to do some more R&D research, to look at more technologies, and to be compensated in a rate process for that R&D? Any thoughts on that topic?
Well, we do micro R&D. We have a lot of kind of projects that we do to try to gauge customer reaction to certain technologies, whether that was early on with an urban turbine or now with our plug-in vehicle, our plug-in stations with the vehicles, whether that's solar on schools and solar around the community to get people familiar with the technology. So we do a lot of demonstrating in that. But if you're looking at the macro of research, I think that's more of a government function on the macro. So I think there's kind of two parts to that question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, at this point, I want to open it up to our audience. You've been pretty patient, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions here. Go ahead, Chris.
And this is really for anybody, maybe best suited for Scott, I'm not sure, but I'm interested in your thoughts on why we've seen such public interest in this particular rate case. We're seeing parties that have never been involved in Wisconsin PSC proceedings. We're seeing all sorts of TV stations at public hearings. We're seeing all kinds of protests. To what do you attribute that?
Well, I think what I attribute that to is that I think people understand that there is this issue out there and they want to be a part of how that issue gets solved. So I think it's a good thing from a public policy perspective that we have this discussion, because this discussion needs to occur. Now, who's right and who's wrong as we sort through this? I mean, we think we have a very defensible, logical proposal, okay? But there are other ideas out there, decoupling, minimum bill, I mean, they're all across the country. People are grappling with this. So people who are interested in these issues know that at this time, over the course of the next 5 or so years, these issues are going to start to sort out across the country, and they want to be a part of what that solution is. So I just go back to, our view is, okay, we understand that. Our customers are engaged. We want to continue to engage them, and that's why we said, okay, after this rate case, we're going to engage our customers and just kind of see where we go from there.
Well, other questions? Andy?
Yes, I've got a clarification and then a couple questions. When mg&e first introduced their proposal, they proposed a 3-year proposal that would have raised the fixed fee for residences to $68 per month, which is what they really wanted. And that would have reduced the kilowatt-hour charge by almost half, which I think would have affected, and it's similar in the commercial side. So I think that would have affected a lot of energy efficiency businesses. And I realize mg&e says, well, we pulled it back. We're going to have a conversation with the community of some sort to be found out later, and then we're going to come back with some other proposal. But to Chris's point, I think for a lot of people, we look at that, we see the intent and where mg&e would like to go, and that's pretty clear. And we need to make sure they and others understand that's not where the community wants to go, because that would definitely undercut efficiency far more than the current proposal does. And so that's just important to keep in mind. The low-income program is very limited and would only help those who are the most poor, would leave out a lot of other people, which adds to the regressive nature of this proposal because it's tied to those who are enrolled in the LIHEAP program, Low-Income Heating Assistance Program. And if you're not enrolled, you might be poor enough to be enrolled, but you're not enrolled for whatever reason, so a lot of people would fall through those cracks. The increases in the bills are the greatest, as Tyler mentioned, for those who consume the less. But I guess the part that I really find amazing is just to hear this continual drumbeat that this existing rate design structure that we've had for decades now is so thoroughly flawed, and that there's for some reason, fixed costs need to be tied to fixed fees. I mean, you know, I fill up my car, I don't get charged for the fixed costs of the gas station or for the oil infrastructure. It's the only industry where they're out there, you know, saying that there's got to be, because the word fixed appears in both places, it's got to be reflected in both. In most cases, it's sufficient for a company to recover their costs.
So is the question, Andy, now, why a fixed fee now? Is that directed to Scott?
No, my question is, you know, I guess to Todd, really, you know, you just kind of make the assertion that, you know, we got to have higher fixed fees on residential customers because there's fixed costs. Do any of your customers, any of your members do their pricing that way?
Well, I mean,
And can you actually like explain why you make that assertion?
oh, first of all, go ahead if you want to jump in. But
Todd's customers aren't in the same business as a regulated utility. A regulated utility has obligations, and a number of those obligations are, and Art hit on it, we have to have 14.5% reserve margin of our peak capacity every day. Okay? There's not a lot of industries. The airlines, so our average day, let's say, is 450 megawatts. Okay? We have to have, and our peak day is closer to 800 megawatts. So we have to have about, I don't want to try to do this math in my head, about 850 megawatts, let's say, for an average sales of 450. Okay, so that, no, let me finish. I'm getting to your question. But it's got to be set up. It's got to be. You got to understand. The other thing we don't have. Okay, so we have that obligation. We also, unlike a regular business, can't go out and charge whatever we want to charge. It is set by the state. So those two things make it very different. And I'm pretty sure most people would not want the utility to run on the skinny at 500 megawatts and then on 15 or 20 days out of the year say, that's all we got. Now, if you want to pay us a lot more, we'll go do something. That's not the regulatory model, how it works. And so that's why the utilities are different than another average business where they can set rates on their own and decide how much capacity and sales they want to put into the market.
That's not really responsive to the question.
Okay.
Well, Todd, did you have a thought here that
Well, that fixed it, then why must there be, you know, variable costs tied to variable fees, variable charges?
Sure. Well, number one, like I said before, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I mean, I'm an mg&e customer. The reason I'm here is because you guys asked me to speak, and I'm happy
and you're getting a large fee for being speaking here, right?
We had a big, so, for the sake of argument, on the principle of it is just, look, we have argued for decades that fixed costs should be in a fixed bucket. Variable costs should be in the variable bucket. It's a very big deal to industrial customers to get that right, and we argue about it in every single rate case. We have this fight every time. You guys all know that that's one of the key things we always talk about. Now, on the industrial side, it's pretty close, is the thing. It's in the ballpark. I'm not here to be, to be defending mg&e's proposal. I really don't have a dog in this fight. But that said, proper cost causation is a principle that should be, it normally is not that big of an issue. In this case, it's, when you asked what's wrong with it for decades, yeah, it's been screwed up for decades. It's been wrong for decades. Why? I think, depending on the PSC staff or commissioners, I don't think they even really thought about it till now, to be honest. It hasn't been on the radar screen, nobody's cared. And, you know, a lot of times staff does the cost of service and rate design, and then,
Well, so from
you know,
WIG
when you
to,
have some of the lowest rates in the country like we used to, you know, who cares if it's a 1% increase?
Well, from
you
WIG
know.
to work, you've got a question, I think.
Just taking this to an extreme, Scott, it costs you, well, maybe not your report, it costs utilities in the state of Wisconsin a lot more to run wires out to rural customers way out in the boonies. If you take this argument to that extreme, does it make sense that rural customers should pay significantly higher electric rates because the wires to serve them cost an arm and a leg more than it does to serve a customer in an urban setting?
Well, the way that extension rule works in the state is this, that the customer, so let's say I live a mile and a half off where the current distribution line is. The way it works is that you take the average embedded cost in the distribution system for a customer, let's say that's $350. So that's what the customer receives as a credit, $350. But if it's a $15,000 extension, the customer has to pay the difference between $15,000 and $350. So that policy has been in place for a number of years in Wisconsin.
But do they pay higher rates on a monthly bill going forward as a result?
No, because once that distribution line is in place, they've paid the extra cost for that. Our customer cost or our energy cost and so on are going to be the same for them pretty much as it is for everybody else. And Tyler raises an interesting point on, you know, how far do you want to segment? We already segment by customer class. I mean, that could be another very interesting policy discussion is how much customer segmentation do you ultimately want and is in the public interest? Is it more or is it less?
We've got about 5 more minutes, and then I think our panelists will stay around. If there's other questions, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Scott, both you and Tyler talked about, and mg&e to its credit said, let's get together and start talking about this, and Tyler wants to talk about it. But is there a distinction between sort of mg&e-led listening sessions and a commission investigation, where that would be done more generically? Do you guys have an opinion on whether that should be done seriatim by utility, or in generic?
Is that to Tyler or me?
You start.
I think that's up to the commission as the policymakers as to where they want to make this decision or decisions along the line.
Any thoughts, Tyler?
Yeah, just going back to my response earlier, that given the utility proposals in this case, clean power plans on the horizon, and a number of other related huge questions for us to look forward on our electric system, I think it would behoove us to have a broader discussion if it can be structured correctly and is structured toward end goals that make sense for the direction that we want to go as a state, to have that broader discussion and then to have utility rate cases and other policies, maybe legislative policies, fall out of sitting and thinking about what do we want it to look like in 20 years. Because I think right now we're starting today and looking backwards at what we've got and looking at today this idea that changes could come. I think what would really behoove us is to look forward. What do we want it to look like at some point in the distant future, and then build a plan to get there that encompasses all these really hard questions. I think that would be valuable to Wisconsin.
And I'll compliment you on that question, Steve, too, because I think I'll just make a personal comment on this whole debate, is that these are very tough issues. People are lining up. I think, as some mentioned, this is probably one of the most emotional rate cases that I've seen in my practice. And if there's a mechanism that we all can think of, especially people in this room, to look for a solution that's a win-win that engages communication. I know in the environmental area, where some of us practice in, there's been work study groups where you come in and try to get a diverse policy mix and try to get some consensus. I mean, I think this is an important issue that Steve raises because this is all going now to 3 appointed commissioners for an incredibly important issue to be followed by lots of other policy issues with the Clean Power Plan, involving unbelievably complex interrelationship issues between the PSC and the DNR as part of an environmental program. These are going to be challenges that I think we never faced before in the energy area. Now, we have probably time for maybe one more question, or also I think our panel members will stay around for a little bit for some offline conversations. I want to stay with our limit here, and I would hope you would join me to extend our appreciation here for our panel members here for, I think, a job well done. I think we'll stay around if there's other questions, right? Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. So we will be back in January, same place, different topic. But I very much want to thank our panel. It was a great group of experts. Really gave some good insight. Thank you, Art. Actually,
My pleasure,
this is
Joe.
Art's idea. So he did a great job. I also want to thank